welcome the students from Hunter College who are here visiting Democracy Now! Today. The music, Bella Gallos singing. She is a Timorese woman. I was with her in East Timor, the day East Timor became an independent nation, independent after 25 years of occupation by Indonesia. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Our guest on the phone from Indonesia is Allan Nairn, award-winning investigative journalist and activist. We're also joined by John Miller here in studio. He's the national coordinator of the East Timor and Indonesia Action Network. Before we go back to Allan, John, I just wanted you to explain how it was that the United States government under the Obama administration restored military aid, restored aid to Kopassus, the Red Berets of the Indonesian military.
Well, all military training to Indonesia was cut off in May 1998 due to another expose of Allan's and some documents Congress got. And gradually, since East Timor voted for independence when all military assistance was suspended, it's been restored. And the only thing that remained restricted was aid to Kopassus because of its human rights record. There's a law, the Leahy Law, that says the U.S. should not train units that have unresolved or ongoing human rights violations, which certainly includes Kopassus. And the Bush administration, actually, a few years ago, tried to restore aid to Kopassus, promised it to the President Yudhoyono, and his own State Department legal team said no. And last summer, Secretary of Defense Gates went to Indonesia on a surprise visit, quick visit, and announced that the U.S. would engage with Kopassus. They didn't say it would be full training, but they said that enough reform had happened. Some of the officers that had been convicted within Kopassus of killing a Papuan leader who had been jailed briefly and then restored to the unit were removed from the unit, though not from the military significantly enough, and that was enough progress to restore this last bit, and that they would focus on counterterrorism training. The thing is that Indonesian counterterrorism efforts have been focused on the police. And many in Indonesia, particularly in the human rights community, would rather not see the military, particularly Kopassus, involved in those efforts. There have been enough police human rights abuses involved in the anti-terrorism effort there.
Allan Nairn, you have just today, right before we went to broadcast, released Kopassus documents on your website, allannairn.com. Explain what these documents show.
These are confidential Kopassus documents. They're part of an archive of documents that they got a hold of. And they describe operations in Papua, in West Papua, the area in the eastern part of the archipelago where the military and the police have killed tens of thousands of civilians. It's effectively sealed off to foreign observers. And these documents describe the fact that the Kopassus is deliberately targeting civilians, deliberately targeting churches, and formally defines its main enemy as civilian dissidents. They have an enemies list of 15 Papuans from the area where the Kopassus unit that wrote these documents operates. The top person on the list is the head of the Baptist synod there. The others include traditional leaders, student activists, intellectuals, the head of the Muslim youth organization. Basically, all of the people who are the leading civic activists, and they are on this secret list as being the enemies of Kopassus, something which is very ominous for Papuans or anyone in Indonesia.
Allan, I'm just going to interrupt for a second. It is a little hard to hear you. It's not a great line, so I want to clarify some points. First of all, tell us about West Papua. Where is it within the Indonesian archipelago? What is its history?
It's on the eastern end. It's under de facto occupation. It became part of Indonesia through a dirty deal among the UN, the Dutch, and the U.S. It was basically absorbed against the will of the Papuans. It is not recognized by the UN as occupied territory, but all of the Papuan population basically thinks of it that way. And these secret Kopassus documents that I've released part of today make it clear in their own analysis that they see that the Papuan people do not want the Kopassus and the Indonesian army there. They want them out. But when they say that, the Indonesian army defines them as the enemy.
Go on with the Kopassus enemies list that you have gotten a hold of and these documents that you've released at allannairn.com. This is very significant given President Obama has just arrived in Indonesia, will be there for some, perhaps 24 hours, though they're saying, because of the volcano and the volcanic ash that could hurt the plane. They may be leaving hours earlier than they planned.
Yeah, it is very significant because Obama's claim was that Kopassus is reforming and cleaning up its act, just as the Indonesian military, the TNI, is also supposedly reforming. But that's just factually inaccurate. The same people who committed the publicized atrocities in East Timor and Aceh are still there. They've been promoted. For example, the person who now runs the Indonesian Defense Ministry, the number two, but he really runs it, is an old Kopassus general, Shafri Samsudin, who was indicted for war crimes in East Timor. According to witnesses, was personally involved in executions. And now President Susilo, the current president, who's also touted as a reformer, gave him control of the defense ministry. So there's this constant claim that they're changing, they're reforming. This happens basically every year in almost every country where the U.S. is backing an oppressive regime. But in the case of Kopassus, these documents refute it. On the West Papua enemies list, for example, one of the people they have there is the mediator of the Papuan Presidium Council. And one of his predecessors, Teus Elway, had his throat slit by Kopassus back in 2001. So when they define you as an enemy, you're in a dangerous situation. And in the documents, they describe what they call the enemy battle of order. They describe the enemy tactics. They say there are two basic enemy tactics. One is calling a press conference to criticize the army and the government, and the second is criticizing the army and the government in a private meeting. So in the Kopassus domain, in West Papua, if you criticize in private or public, you get defined as an enemy, and you're subject to, as they put it, abduction and murder, which they say is routine among the security forces. These are Kopassus's own words. I spoke to some of the people who were listed as Kopassus enemies, some of the ministers, the political activists, one of whom I reached in prison last night, and they described receiving a constant stream of SMS, text message, telephone, death threats, being followed day and night, having infiltrators sent into their houses, surviving assassination attempts, and as one of the pastors put it, this is normal life for a religious person in Papua, and it's even worse for the farmers, the people in the countryside. In the highlands, the Puncak Jaya area, this past summer, the military did sweeps where they burned villages. They killed civilians. And one of the ministers who was on the Kopassus enemies list gave a good explanation for why they do this. He said they usually do this twice a year, right before the provincial legislature decides them in contributions to the military budget. And so the military goes up into the hills, burns some houses, burns some churches, shoots some people, say that there are enemies out there, and they say they need more money, and they extract it from the government budget. It's basically what militaries around the world do, including the U.S. military. They conjure up or exaggerate threats in order to get more money and power.
Allan, I wanted to talk about the case of Munir Talib, the Indonesian human rights activist, the most important human rights activist in Indonesia, or I should say the most well-known one. Because when we were in Bonn, Germany recently for a gathering of the Right Livelihood Award winners, he was one of the laureates, I met his wife, Suciwati, and we want to play her description of what happened to her husband. But I'd like you to set it up, who Munir was, what his significance is, and how that relates to what we're talking about today, the Indonesian military, Kopassus, and human rights abuses.
Munir was a great man. He was a friend of mine. He was brilliant. Many Indonesians rightly saw him as a possible great future leader of the country. He was the toughest, most outspoken, most fearless human rights advocate, and the military killed him for it. There was a very telling incident right after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. Munir at that time, he had various human rights groups, and he was getting some money for them from USAID. So he had a relationship with the U.S. Embassy. But he went out and led demonstrations against the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. The U.S. Embassy called him in and chewed him out and told him that he was consorting with and aiding terrorists. And while this was going on, the Indonesian military under General Wiranto sent thugs to attack him in his office and accused him of being a puppet of the United States, which is hypocritical since they were receiving weapons from the United States. But for demagogic reasons, they said he was a U.S. puppet. So they sent the mobs after him, while the U.S. was accusing him with playing with terrorists. But Munir always spoke his mind and opposed the killing of civilians. And what happened to him was he, at one point, became burnt out, essentially. It seemed to me that he needed a rest. And he decided to go to the Netherlands to study, to work on a law advanced studies program. He boarded a flight, and he died on the plane. He vomited to death from arsenic poisoning. He was slipped arsenic, and this has been established in court, by an agent of BIN, the Indonesian Presidential Intelligence Agency. That agent was in direct communication right before and right after the poisoning with the General Mukti, who was the number 2 man of BIN, the Presidential Intelligence Agency. Now, the BIN was and is today an associate of the American CIA. They have a relationship that a senior BIN official recently described to me as being extremely close. And in fact, the man who was boss of BIN at the time that the BIN killed Munir, General Hendrik Yono, was so close to the U.S. That he was granted personal meetings with Tenet, then the CIA chief, and Mueller, then the FBI chief, and he was often brought over to Langley for consultation. And his right-hand man, General Mukti, went out and had Munir poisoned on the plane.
We're going to break early and then come back and hear a clip of Munir himself, and then go to his wife, Suciwati, who continues to call for justice in the murder of her husband and to call for the end of human rights abuses in Indonesia. We're speaking with Allan Nairn, journalist and activist, who's just released at allannairn.com, ALLANNAIRN.com, documents from Kopassus itself, including a target list, an enemies list, that includes everyone from a Baptist minister in West Papua to the head of the Muslim youth organization there. This is Democracy Now!, Democracy